unmute.
Yeah, it is.
Webinar is now streaming live on Facebook.
We're ready when you are.
Good morning, صباح الخير, مساء الخير, buenas tardes, buenos dias for the people who are joining us in many other places. Thank you so much for joining us. This is an amazing conversation. My name is Rabab Abdelhadi. I'm the director of the Arab and Muslim Ethnicities and Diaspora Studies program at San Francisco State University, and I will be moderating this conversation. I begin by acknowledging that San Francisco State University sits on the stolen indigenous land of the Ohlone Nation and continues to be indigenous, and we continue to have a commitment to defeat and end the settler colonial project in the US, as you will see from all our esteemed colleagues. I also start by stopping for a moment of silence to honor all the martyrs who have fallen in the streets of the United States, in the streets of Palestine, in South Africa, in Lebanon, in Puerto Rico, in Vietnam, in Cuba, anywhere around the world, in Kashmir, in everywhere around the world. We honor everybody. We remember a lot of, now there is a big campaign around Patrice Lumumba, who was killed by colonial forces. So we also remember the martyrs who have fallen long time ago, the martyrs who have fallen for our people's struggle, the martyrs who continue to fall day in and day out. And I shudder to listen to hear about that. Secondly, I want to just introduce the team who is working with us and thank the people who have done the work behind the scene. I begin by the person who designed the beautiful poster, Sarah Sills, who is an active member of the executive committee of the New York City Jewish Voice for Peace. Thank you so much. I would like to acknowledge the team, the technical team and the student team who are working with us here. Anais Amir from Wellesley College, Jacob Perez from the Theological Studies at the University of the Pacific, formerly of Ahmed Studies, Rafael Isa, who's now in Savannah, Georgia, but was very active with the National Students for Justice in Palestine. And last but not least, Salim Shhade, who is a doctoral student at UCLA, and Ahmed involved. We also have with us from Beirut, Lebanon, Ubada, who has been working in day in and day out with behind the scenes. And we also have on the screen with us Dr. Samah Idris, the editor of Al-Adab, and Dr. Rania Al-Masri, professor at Lebanese American University and a long time also colleague and co-collaborator. So I'm going to turn it over to actually Samah to do the introduction in Arabic. We have many people joining us in many parts of the world, and then I will get back to it. So Samah, please go ahead.
مساء الخير. Good evening. رباب أول شيء هي رحبت فيكم جميعا. عم ترجم سؤال رباب ملخص. هي اللي حتكون مديرة هذا اللقاء في جامعة سان فرانسيسكو في ولاية كاليفورنيا، التي تقع على أرض مسروقة من الشعب الأصلي الذي كان هو أصل ما يسمى اليوم بالولايات المتحدة الأمريكية، ويبقى هذا الشعب يناضل من أجل هزيمة المشروع الاستيطاني الكولونيالي للولايات المتحدة. وطلبت بأن نقف دقيقة الصمت عن أرواح الشهداء من الولايات المتحدة إلى بورتوريكو، إلى كوبا، إلى لبنان، إلى فلسطين، إلى كشمير، إلى كل مكان يناضل من أجل العدالة، وأن نتذكر كل من سقط من أجل في كفاح الشعوب. الآن سأتكلم بالعربية لأقدم هذه الندوة. أهلا وسهلا بكم. اسمي سماح إدريس، أنا رئيس تحرير مجلة الآداب التي أسسها والد الروائي والمعجمي الدكتور سهيل إدريس سنة 1953 بعد نيله الدكتوراه من جامعة السوربون. درست في الولايات المتحدة في جامعة كولومبيا حيث نلت شهادة الدكتوراه سنة 1991 في الدراسات الشرق الأوسطية، إلى جانب رفيقتي الغالية الدكتورة رانيا المصري، وهي أيضا مثلي عضو في حملة مقاطعة داعمي إسرائيل في لبنان التي تأسست سنة 2002 وتبقى واحدة من أقوى حركات مقاطعة الكيان الصهيوني ومناهضة التطبيع معه في الوطن العربي. أيها الباحثون والضيوف المناضلون، أفتخر كثيرا بأن تستضيفكم مجلة الآداب ودار الآداب. المجلة والدار هما من أعرق منابر الأدب العربي الحديث والفكر التحرري، ومن أبرز الداعمين لتحرير فلسطين والوطن العربي من الاستعمار والصهيونية والاستبداد والتبعية الاقتصادية. منذ الستينيات اهتمت المجلة كما دار الآداب التي انبثقت من المجلة بعد 3 أعوام بمثقفين ومناضلين أمريكيين السود أمثال مالكوم إكس، ومنذ عقود طويلة عرفنا بموميا أبو جمال وبحركات التحرر الأمريكية السوداء والسكان الأصليين فيما يسمى الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية اليوم. كما عرفنا بمثقفين أمريكيين تقدميين كثيرين كأنجيلا ديفيس ونوم تشومسكي وأدوارد سعيد وهاورد زين وعشرات آخرين. كان ذلك الاهتمام الخاص ويبقى جزءاً من إيماننا بتكامل العدالة وتكامل النضال المعرفي والميداني عبر العالم، خصوصاً لأن النظام الأمريكي هو الحليف الأكبر بالمال والسلاح والسياسة للكيان الصهيوني الذي يغتصب أرضنا ومياهنا ويحرم شعبنا الفلسطيني حقه في العودة منذ العام 1948. هذه الندوة تتحقق اليوم بفضل عدة أشخاص، أبرزهم الرفيقة العزيزة الدكتورة رباب عبد الهادي. التقيت رباب سنة 1987 لعلها لا تذكر ذلك حتى في مظاهرة في نيويورك، وما زالت إلى اليوم بالحماس ذاته وبحس العدالة ذاته وبالعناد المبدئي ذاته. كما أنوه بفريق عمل ممتاز على رأسه الصديقة الحبيبة عبادة كسر المشرفة على موقع مجلة الآداب، والدكتورة رانيا المصري الأستاذة في الجامعة اللبنانية الأمريكية، ورفيقتي شبه اليومية في العمل ضد الصهيونية والتدخل الاستعماري في بلادنا منذ العام 2003. بسم الله، وإن شاء الله يمتدوا أكثر، فضلا عن الرفاق أحمد من مخيم شتيلة مش معنا الآن، وسليم ورافائيل في كاليفورنيا، والآن تعرفنا على أنايس أيضا. أشير أخيرا إلى أن هذه الندوة ستكون جزءا من سلسلة ندوات رقمية مع مركز آماد، آمل أن تطلعكم على بعضها الدكتورة رباب في نهاية هذه الندوة. دوري الآن سيكون شأن دور الدكتورة رانيا هو ترجمة ملخص مداخلات المتحدثين إلى العربية، على أن ننشر كافة المداخلات كاملة باللغة العربية في العدد المقبل من مجلة الآداب خلال أيام. من جديد أعبر لكم عن فخري بكم أيها الأساتذة الكرام، وعن شكري لقبولكم دعوة الآداب وآماد، وآمل أن تتعزز علاقتنا في المستقبل لما فيه خير شعوبنا وبما يخدم قضية التحرر من الاستعمار والصهيونية والعنصرية وكافة أشكال الظلم. شكرا.
دكتورة رانيا بدك تحكي بالإنجليزي؟
ولا
أنا ممكن أوكي
I will just briefly translate what our dear friend Samah has said. Samah introduced himself as the editor of Al-Adab magazine and Al-Adab publishing house, and introduced us both as members of the Lebanese campaign to boycott supporters of Israel in Lebanon. Al-Adab magazine and Al-Adab publishing house are both proud to host this discussion and to host you all. Both have been very active since the 1960s in supporting activists and intellectuals from the Black liberation movement in the United States, including Malcolm X and Al-Adab. Both the magazine and the publishing house have also hosted progressive intellectuals, including Howard Zinn. This discussion itself is a culmination of efforts with Dr. Rabab, whom Samah met decades ago, and is also a culmination of efforts with many other individuals and comrades in our boycott struggle, as well as in our broader liberation struggle. This discussion will be one of a series of discussions with AMET. Our role here, both Samah and myself, will be the translation of a summary of the discussion into Arabic, and later there will be a full translation of the transcripts published in Al-Adab magazine. We are both deeply proud and honored to be with the esteemed list of speakers that we have, and we thank you all and deeply look forward to the continued collaboration as part of our broader struggle for liberation and justice. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And Samah and Rania, Dr. Samah and Dr. Rania have already elaborated on what is this all about. And without further ado, I want us to get into the discussion. So we came together as a result of this collaboration. I just want to say in Arabic that Ahmed is البرنامج الأكاديمي لدراسات الجاليات العربية والمسلمة في المهجر، لأنه بالعربي بتقولوا آمد وما حدش بيعرف إيش آمد، فبهمني كثير جمهور العربي. I just said what Ahmed stands for in Arabic because it's very short and people don't necessarily know what it is. So it's really, really important, especially because it's a program under attack and we want to be able to continue what we are doing. So this came about as a collaboration between Al-Adab and the Ahmed Studies program. It is going to be published in a special issue of Al-Adab focused on US in depth, US from inside. There have been multiple articles have been written already, panels, and there will be more. And this is an attempt by Al-Adab, and we are very much supportive of that, in order to make sure that we get on the same page, even if we don't agree, but get on the same page of what is going on in different parts of our communities in order for us to strengthen and consolidate and educate each other around the whole struggle for the indivisibility of justice for all of us, in order for us to actually not only frame the indivisibility of justice, but actually achieve justice and liberation and freedom for all our communities, hopefully in our lifetime, but even if it's not in our lifetime, many generations will come after us. I wanted to also say that the list of sponsors are on the Facebook. Please check them out. And then we also have many people joining us, and we will announce as we go along. I wanted now to introduce the amazing, amazing esteemed, and I'm only going to do now the official introduction with the official bios, and then we can talk about multiple ways in which our lives have intersected and came together. I'm going to go alphabetically. So first, the first is Dr. Angela Davis. Dr. Angela Davis is a scholar, activist, writer, and distinguished professor emerita of history of consciousness and feminist studies at University of California, Santa Cruz. Her work as an educator, both at the university level and in the larger public sphere, has always emphasized the importance of building communities of struggle for economic, racial, and gender justice. She is the author of 10 books, including Women, Race and Class, Blues, Women and Black Feminisms, Gertrude Ma Rainey, Bessie Smith and Billie Holiday, Are Prisons Obsolete?, The Meaning of Freedom, and Other Difficult Dialogues, and more recently, Freedom is a Constant Struggle, Ferguson, Palestine, and the Foundation of a Movement. Having helped to popularize the notion of a prison industrial complex, she now urges her audiences to think seriously about the future possibilities of a world without prisons and to help forge a 21st century abolitionist movement. The next participant is going to be Dr. Beverly Shiftal, who is the founding director of the Women's Research and Resource Center in 1981 and the Anna Julia Cooper Professor of Women's Studies at Spelman College in Georgia. People don't know where Spelman College is. And it's one of the historically colleges that I think is really important for our audiences to also know that. And maybe we will be able to discuss it. Maybe we will also discuss it in future, how these histories came about, also because they resonate a lot with many of the institutions, anti-colonial educational institutions in the Arab world and elsewhere in the world. For many years, she was a visiting professor at Emory University's Institute for Women's Studies, where she taught graduate courses in women's studies. At the age of 16, she entered Spelman, where she majored in English and minored in secondary education. After graduating with honors, she attended Wellesley College, Anais, for a fifth year of study in English. In 1968, she entered Atlanta to pursue a master's degree in English. Her thesis was entitled Faulkner's Treatment of Women in His Major Novels. A year later, she began her first teaching job in the Department of English at Alabama State University in Montgomery, Alabama. In 1971, she returned to her alma mater, Spelman College, and joined the English department. She has published many texts in African American women's studies, which have been noted, including on Black women's literature, Sunny Black Ridges, Visions of Black Women in Literature, which she co-edited with Roseanne Bell and Betty Parker Smith. Her dissertation, Daughters of Sorrow, Attitudes Towards Black Women, 1880 to 1991, Words of Fire, an anthology of African and American feminist thought, an anthology she co-edited with Rudolph Byrd. An anthology she co-edited with Rudolph, my phone is acting, Rudolph Byrd, entitled Traps, African American Men on Gender and Sexuality. She co-authored with Janetta Betch Cole, and we can actually talk about Janetta. That's another big discussion. She co-edited an anthology, I Am Your Sister. Also, it included writings on Audre Lorde, and co-edited with Rudolph Byrd and Janetta Kell, as well as Beverly. Anthology Still Brave. I am going to actually, we're going to put all the bios on this, because if I'm going to read all the bios of everybody, I want to say one thing about Beverly. And actually, I'll leave that till later. I'm going to say that later. Dio, Dr. Dio Gore. Dr. Dio Gore is an associate professor of African American Studies at Georgetown University. Prior to joining the department, she was an associate professor in the Department of Ethnic Studies and the Critical Gender Studies program at the University of California, San Diego, and founding director of the Black Studies Project at University of California, San Diego. She's author of Radicalism at the Crossroads, African American Women's Activists in the Cold War. Topic doesn't get discussed much, but very important today, especially, and which charts the political commitment and strategic leadership of a network of Black women radicals operating within the US left from the 1930s to the 1960s. She is also the editor with Jean Theoharis and Komozi Woodard of Want to Start a Revolution? Radical Women in the Black Freedom Struggle. And we will say more about that in a minute. Dr. Gerald Horn. Dr. Gerald Horn holds the Moores Professorship of History and African American Studies. His research has addressed issues of racism in a variety of relations involving labor, politics, civil rights, international relations, and war. He has also written extensively about the film industry, and he received his PhD in history from Columbia University, Samah, you are alumni, and his JD from University of California, Berkeley, and his BA from Princeton University. Dr. Horn's undergraduate courses include Civil Rights Movement, US History through Film. He teaches graduate courses in diplomatic history, labor history, 20th century African American history. And Dr. Horn is the author of more than 30 books and 100 scholarly articles and reviews. His current research includes an examination of US Southern Africa relations since the so-called Anglo-Boer War at the end of the 19th century, and analysis of the political economy of the music called, in parentheses, jazz, from the late 19th century to the present. Last but not least is Dr. Robin D.J. Kelly. And Dr. Kelly is, for the Arab listeners, by the way, G stands for Gibran, just so people, okay, I think it's important to say that. He is the author of several books, including Freedom Dreams, The Black Radical Tradition. He has written broadly on Black Palestinian solidarity, BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions, cultural boycott, the history of Black movements, and Zionism. His essays on Palestine have appeared in publications such as Mundawais, Counterpunch, Social Text, Boston Review, Journal of Palestine Studies, as well as anthologies, Apartheid in Israel, The Politics of an Analogy, Letters to Palestine, Writers Respond to War and Occupation, and With Stones in Our Hands, Reflections on Racism, Muslims, and US Empire. And this ends the formal bios. Now I'm not going to spoil a lot of surprises, but I'm going to actually start with our colleagues asking to just share, how did you get here? What were the factors that you engaged in? What were you doing? And I may actually step in to mention, because I know a lot about each one of you, and I've been following you, and I know some things that might be known. So I'm going to just say a couple of things about Angela Davis, and Angela can speak about that, a long, long time former political prisoner, who many people actually, including my own partner, became politicized with a picture of, I support Angela Davis when Angela was in prison. And I will leave it to Angela to speak about her relationship with Palestinian prisoners and the solidarities that's going on, but also Angela's article about, for example, the sterilization of indigenous, Black, and Puerto Rican women has, among other things, has been very influential in teaching many of us about the whole question of reproductive rights and freedoms. And I'm going to stop at that. I can say more things to embarrass you, but I will hold it a little bit. Beverly Guishaftal was the leader of the Brownie of National Women's Studies Association. That is really important. People do not know that. When we talk about Palestine passing in 2015, the support for Palestine and the boycott, divestment sanction in National Women's Studies Association, it wasn't just all those of us who were in the Puerto Rico conference in 2014, along with many our Puerto Rican sisters and comrades. It really had to do with this, with the contextual changes with the NWSA, at the helm of which stood Beverly Guishaftal, and she really browned NWSA. And there is so much more history that we can talk about, so I will leave it at that. I would want to go next to Dayo. Dayo's book, people really need to read that. And Dayo, in Dayo's edited book, not only the latest book, there is, so you want to be a revolutionary. One of the amazing things about that book is actually it talks about all these women who not only were revolutionaries, but who were not really very well known about, but also the ones who crossed. And I don't want to really even use the word intersectionality. I want to talk about how they crossed and they worked with each other and they came together before we even came up with the concept of the indivisibility of justice. Many, many years ago, thinking about that, and a lot of times, even in the Arab world, in our circles and so on, we know the big names, let's say in the women's movement. August 19th is going to be the 100th anniversary of US suffrage, getting the vote. But many of these names who actually changed history were in that book. So I love it and I highly recommend it. I want to also speak next about Gerald Horn. Samah, just you and I, we go back to New York, and Gerald was actually, this is how I met you. Gerald was a very long activist in radical circles in New York City, and was one of the people who constantly was supportive of the Palestinian struggle, of the demands of many people and so on, at the time when many people were not actually talking about Palestine. And I don't know how much I can out your history, but I think also it's really been very important now, come July 4th, so-called US independence. Many years before, Gerald, you've been talking a lot about what does, quote unquote, the Declaration of Independence mean? What has been going on? And some people were saying, let's not really talk about it and so on. And now, this is the work of everybody, all of you, that's actually coming to the fore and saying all you have been saying all along. Now it's becoming actually, let's say, I don't want to even use the word legitimize, but let's say it in quote unquote mainstream circles. And of course, some people are trying to co-opt the movement. Last but not least, Robin Kelly, whom I've met when I was a postdoc at NYU right after 9/11/2001 and right after the Aqsa Intifada and the attacks on Palestine and the preparation for the invasion of Iraq. And Robin used to be every single time available for every single thing. And I think we met the first time when you presented your book, Freedom Dreams. And then, Robin continues to have the back of graduate students, of people who are not defended. And I was also honored, just with like Angela and Beverly, we were on the Indigenous Women of Color Feminist Delegation. Robin, we went to the Teaching Palestine in 2018. We had 2 conferences with An-Najah and Birzet, and also we went to South Africa in 2019. Dayo and Gerald, your turn is coming. COVID-19 is preventing us from doing this, but once all of this is lifted, we really should have a date in Palestine and also go to Lebanon as well in order to meet all. So I'm going to open up and ask you all to speak about your histories, your intellectual histories. What brought you here? What made you who you are? I know you can't talk about all of it, but in 3 minutes, just give us headlines. And this is a task for all of us to go read more and learn more. And we will share a lot of resources. So why don't we start with you, Angela? And then after everybody speaks, Samah and Rania are going to translate that in Arabic in like 5 minutes, very briefly. Angela, please go ahead.
Thank you, Rabab. And first of all, thank you for organizing this panel. And let me say what an honor it is to share this virtual platform with all of these wonderful scholar activists from whom I continue to learn so much. 3 minutes or less. My background is in philosophy, more specifically critical theory. Because I had the opportunity to study with Herbert Marcuse during the 1960s, I learned that the importance of knowledge resides precisely in its capacity to impel us to conceptualize as yet unrealized ways of being in the world. And so I say that to say that my intellectual work has always been linked to processes of envisioning better worlds, more radical, more democratic, more socialist futures. I grew up in the South, and I attribute my conviction that ordinary human beings who join together can create powerful collective movements that can change the world. And I attribute that to my early upbringing and education under conditions of racial segregation and all of the many struggles to abolish these conditions. I can also mention that I was fired from my first teaching job at UCLA because I was a member of the Communist Party. And as you said, Rabab, I spent time in jail, having been charged with capital offenses. And I mention this because of the fact that people all over the world, including political prisoners, were active in the campaign for my freedom. And I've said, as you know, many times that I was especially moved when I received a message from Palestinian political prisoners that was smuggled out of an Israeli jail and brought into me when I was in jail. And I don't know, I should have been keeping time. It seems like I've been talking a long time, but I will mention the fact that virtually everyone who was involved in the Black liberation movement in the early 70s was familiar with Sami al-Qasim's poem, Enemy of the Sun, and other Palestinian poems that were included in that wonderful collection that was also called Enemy of the Sun. The ties between radical Black movements and the struggle to free Palestine go back many, many decades. But let me conclude by saying that I've been doing both scholarly and activist work over the last period, focused on prison abolition, which also entails the abolition of policing as we know it. Most of us have assumed that abolition as a political goal was located in a future we were able to imagine but not yet experience. And that has included, of course, the future of a free Palestine. Today, the resonances of abolition are far more widespread than any of us could have ever imagined. And the lessons we've learned from the Palestinian struggle have helped us to think much more expansively about the meaning of Black liberation.
Thank you, Angela. Beverly?
Do I have to hit anything, or am I okay the way I am?
No, you're good. You're good.
Okay.
You're good.
Like Angela, I want to thank you, Rabab, for bringing us all together. And I want to say how thrilled I am to be sharing this platform with all of the folk here with whom I have interesting personal histories as well. I want to start, like Angela, I'm a product of the Deep South. I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee. Angela and I are actually 2 years apart. Grew up in the deep South of apartheid, Jim and Jane Crow South of Memphis, Tennessee. I grew up in a family of teachers who were very committed to the civil rights struggle. In fact, my grandfather was there at the church the night before Martin was assassinated. The other part of my history that is extremely important is that I came to Spelman College, and I'll just say a little bit, Bob, you reminded me that people may not know. I came to Spelman College in 1962. Spelman College, founded in 1881, is the oldest historically Black college for women in the US. And I came there in 1962 at the height of the student movement and actually marched with Martin King. I should also mention that because I went to Montgomery on a regular basis and went to Dexter Avenue Baptist Church with my father, I had already experienced Martin as a minister. So I knew him. I'll also say, because this is extremely important, I'm also a student of Howard Zinn and Stoughton Lynn, who taught at Spelman College, taught history. And I would say that the beginning of my radical thinking and my evolving radical intellect came from being in Howard Zinn and Stoughton Lynn's classes, and also Vincent Hardy. I'm gonna fast forward and talk a little bit about when I came back to Spelman to be in the English department in 1971. And I think the most important part of my journey at Spelman, which I haven't talked about very much, is participating in the lock-in of the Board of Trustees as an untenured faculty member in 1976. So my struggles have been external, but also internal. And that was a Black feminist struggle to make sure that finally, after 100 years, Spelman College would have an African-American woman president. We had had white women presidents and 2 Black male presidents, and that resulted in Janetta Cole being the first Black woman president. And it wasn't just that she was a Black woman, it was also that she was a radical feminist who almost didn't get that job because of her connections to Cuba. And so I think it's really, really important to say that. Most of my work has been in the area of Black feminist studies, beginning initially with literature, and then spending much of my thinking life trying to make visible and excavate the work of Black feminist scholars, activists, artists going back to the 19th century. And then the final thing that I would say in this connection is one of the most important aspects of my continuing evolution was my involvement in the delegation to Palestine. And I want to say that that transformed my political evolution in very many ways. And one of the concrete results of that is that Spelman College is now the only HBCU with a Students for Justice in Palestine chapter. And I need to call out a student of mine, Bana Gabadian, who was a Syrian American who also had a tremendous impact on me sitting in my classes. So students also impact professors. So I think I'll stop there.
Thank you. We'll move to Dayo.
So first, I really want to thank Rabab for inviting me to join this amazing conversation. I feel so honored to be among these scholars who have their work and their commitment to both scholarship and activism have completely informed my own work in activism. And I think made it possible for Black scholars and activists to see the ways that you can continue this work while also being in the academy, which I think is an important model, and have strategies for survival in that context. I would say that for me, my most profound intellectual and sort of personal experiences that form me today start with me growing up as a Black girl in Detroit, Michigan in the 70s and 80s, and with parents who believed in sort of thinking, sometimes yelling, always engaging the world around us. And these politics weren't about protest, so I didn't grow up in an activist family per se, but it did produce a mixture of a sort of Black power, Black nationalist, civil rights, respectability politics. That meant in my house, we had, I remember this vividly growing up, Dick Gregory's comedy albums, his political writings, and his diet book, which my mom was a big fan of. And so for me, some of the core ideas was that in Detroit in the 70s and 80s, you could engage in the world you lived in. You were required to, even if you weren't an activist. And I didn't really come into my own political sort of engagement and radicalism until college, as many people do. I became politicized in college, particularly around CIA off-campus campaigns and the first Gulf War, which really introduced me to the Palestinian struggle and sort of the occupation, Israeli occupation, and sort of the importance of that for the work I was trying to do on the ground, both on campus and in Chicago. And I think also in that moment in Chicago, I had the real opportunity to meet amazing activist scholars like Barbara Ransby, who were doing amazing work to participate in sort of the founding of the Black Radical Congress, to be around when AWIDU, African American Women in Defense of Ourselves, was initiated. And then my second sort of, I think, moment occurred when I moved to New York for graduate school at NYU and was mentored by an amazing scholar and a real committed activist, Robin Kelly, who had sort of done this amazing work with Hammer and Home, that made it seem possible for me as someone who was committed to activism to actually be able to go and do scholarship and sort of read and do political work at the same time. And I think with his support and other scholars at NYU, I was actually able to do that. So most of my time at NYU was some going to classes, but to be quite honest, mostly organizing, particularly around doing anti-police violence work, because it was the heart of the Giuliani era and the Broken Windows campaign. And I was working with a newly formed organization called the Audre Lorde Project, which is an LGBTQ two-spirit organization for people of color communities. And I was really active in a coalitional group called Coalition Against Police Brutality, CAP-B, that did a lot of organizing from the mid-90s to the 2000s around numerous cases in New York around police brutality. Probably Amadou Diallo was the most well-known, but numerous others. And that was a real learning experience for me because it allowed me to see the work that's necessary to build solidarity across multiracial coalitions. So it was a coalition that included Richie Perez's The Justice Committee, Malcolm X Grassroots, CAB, Organizing Asian Communities. And we really had to negotiate both our own ways of thinking about violence and police and state-sanctioned violence and how it impacted our communities, but also how we could build those solidarities across those organizations. And I think that work was really important, not only for me as an activist, right, but I think for me as a scholar to really think about moments of organizing that don't necessarily produce spectacular victories, and what that means and what that does. And so much of my research and work is looking at Black women in the left who work on, particularly in the 40s and 50s, that was my first book, where they weren't seen as successful, but I think had a profound impact on how we think about sort of Black women's organizing, how we think about the intersections of race, gender, and class, how we think about transnational solidarities and international. And so maybe I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Gerald, Dr. Horn?
Well, I was born in St. Louis, but my roots are in Mississippi, the heart of darkness, with regard to both Jim Crow and slavery. I just found out a few weeks ago that my father, who of course carries the name Horn, actually was not named Horn, but he fled Mississippi for St. Louis and changed his name, which is how I got this name Horn. In any case, I grew up in Jim Crow St. Louis, US apartheid St. Louis, but the world was changing with the Cold War and the United States finding it difficult to make human rights claims against the socialist count when people of color were being treated so atrociously here, which then opened the door for a person like myself and others to attend college. At first I was a lawyer in New York City, as you mentioned, working
National Conference of Black Lawyers.
Exactly,
National Conference of
Black Lawyers, Hospital Workers Union, etc. I was also an activist. In fact, I recall going to Beirut some decades ago and interviewing Chairman Arafat right before he was forced to evacuate to Tunisia. So you can pinpoint the date when I was there. But at a certain point, I found that my activism was hampered, in my estimation, by people's understanding of the history of the United States, which I felt was much too naive, to put it mildly, basically giving settler colonialism a pass. And so then I decided to start writing history. And in fact, I'll end on this point. My latest book, which is on the 16th century, has a major role for the former colonizing power in historic Palestine, speaking of the Ottoman Turks. And as I tell the story, a turning point which leads to many of us winding up in North America comes in 1453 when the Ottoman Turks take over what is now Istanbul, and which sends Western Europe Christendom into a frenzy and leading the Spanish to sponsor Columbus's journey. The contestation then is between the Ottoman Turks and the so-called Catholic powers. And I think the Ottoman Turks underestimated the power with which they made an alliance. Speaking of this minor kingdom on the fringes of Europe, the English, the people whose language we're now speaking, by the way. And that underestimation obviously had a terrible knock-on effects as England surged into the lead and constructed the British Empire, and then helped to transport all these Africans, including my ancestors, to North America, not to mention taking over from the Ottoman Turkey in terms of historic Palestine, and bumbling and fumbling that particular mission as well. So I'll stop there and wait for the discussion. And once again, let me echo the thanks to you, Rabab, for bringing us here. And thanks to all of these wonderful panelists from whom I've learned quite a bit.
Thank you, Robin.
Yeah, thank you, Rabab, for bringing us all together. I was doing a calculation in terms of my relationship to everyone on this panel, including yourself. It comes out to like 125 years of history. And I really mean that. I did the calculation, and it's so interesting because Gerald, when in 1986, when I was working on my dissertation, Gerald kind of took me under his wing and met with me and gave me some great advice. I learned more from Dale Gore in my seminars than she learned from me, by the way. So that's another one of my mentors. Beverly and Angela have been like models of scholarship and activism, and people that I turn to for advice and direction. And of course, for Bob, all of your work, pushing me really hard. So let me just very quickly jump into this. I mean, I was born in the early 60s and grew up in Harlem at first and moved to California, but my mother was mostly single, Jamaican migrant who was deeply spiritual. And that's how I got the middle name Gibran, because she was reading Khalil Gibran, even though she dropped out of high school. It's kind of an autodidact. And it was a period of, the end of the 60s, 5 years old in 1968, but remember vividly, some of the urban rebellions and struggles taking place in New York City into the early 70s and entering into the kind of neoliberal era where, as a young person in the 1970s, after moving to California, we're dealing with the global economic crisis of 73. And after that, we're dealing with, the last anti-colonial wars in Vietnam, in Zimbabwe, Namibia, South Africa, the Portuguese colonies. We're dealing with in the 1980s, when I become, active politically and graduate from high school and go to college. This is the era that we think of as the right-wing turn, as the era of Reaganism and Thatcher and China's kind of neoliberal shift, and the collapse of the Soviet Union and Eastern Bloc countries. But it's also a period of the 80s, which I really want to highlight as a period of intense struggle, a kind of interesting turn to Marxism, and where I was a member of a left party, like a lot of people, and we did essentially work grounded in international solidarity around sanctuary movement, or the protests against the invasion of Grenada and Panama. This is the era of the first Intifada. I mean, those are the politics that shaped me and why I became a historian, and why, reading Marxism, reading feminist theory, reading anti-colonial and anti-racist thinkers pushed me to become an historian, to write about radical social movements and art and ideas that push back against racism, capitalism, patriarchy, dispossession, and empire. And I just want to just end by saying that, you know, that's the work I was doing, and Palestine was always there, but it really hit me in 2012 when I visited for the first time in January with a delegation organized by US ACBI, cultural boycott against Israel. And in that delegation, and I actually stayed a week longer than my co-delegates, I learned straight up, face to face, what colonialism, what settler colonialism looks like in a different place, and could recognize some of the aspects of it in the United States and elsewhere, but it really did change everything. And from that point on, I began to write about Palestine and Black Palestinian solidarities and these kinds of questions, which was never really sort of on my radar in the same way. So that was transformative, and it's really shaped my politics in scholarship in a significant way. So I thank everyone here for teaching me as I'm still trying to learn.
Thank you so much. We are going now to turn to Dr. Samah and Dr. Rania to give a summary. Before I do that, I'm just going to give you the next question to kind of like think about while they're doing the translation, right? Because you've spoken a lot of things that so we can even stop and we can have a conversation. You could all have a conversation with each other. But I wanted first to say that actually we have amazing esteemed scholars. It's very important for people in the Arab world and people in all our communities and so on to realize that there are hundreds and thousands of scholars who can also join in, who will join in with their intellectual contribution, with their activism and so on. So I think it's really, really important for us to keep remembering that we are a collective movement, and this all of us are moving forward and are able to do it because of we all stand on each other's shoulders and the shoulders of people who have passed. So what I wanted to ask you when we come back about the moment, what is this moment that how is this moment different than other moments? Because there have been many examples and so on. Is it different? How does it connect to the whole settler colonialism, 1492? The whole connection between settler colonialism and white supremacy and anti-Blackness, and the attacks against immigrants, the policing, all of these things are coming together in a way that we have not, I think we haven't seen before. So we can actually come back and talk about that. I do have specific questions to each of you, but I'm going to turn it over to Samah and Rania to do a summary. And also if you wanted to also comment on each other and have a conversation with each other, would be the next round. So go ahead, Samah and Rania, please.
طيب اوكي مرحبا من جديد. رح نحاول انه نترجم الى العربيه مختصر مفيد لما تحدث به هؤلاء الباحثون المميزون عن خلفياتهم التي جاءت بهم الى حيث هم الان سياسيا وثقافيا. كل المتحدثين هنا يعني لديهم عقود من التجربه والنشاط والتضامن مع نضالات الشعوب في العالم. أنجيلا ديفيس هي من جامعة كاليفورنيا في سانتا كروز، هي ناشطة ومناضلة عريقة ومؤلفة لكتب كثيرة، آخرها كتاب بعنوان الحرية هي نضال ثابت ودائم من فيرغسون إلى فلسطين. هي تحث الناس دوما على أن يفكروا، على أن يتخيلوا عالما بدون سجون، وهي نفسها هي سجينة سياسية لوقت طويل، وهي كتبت عن كيف تم يعني خصي sterilization النسوة في بورتوريكو، وكانت دراستها منيرة ومثرية إلى حد كبير. بيفرلي جاي شيفر هو بروفيسور في بروفيسور في جامعة سبيلمان في جورجيا، وهي أستاذة الدراسات النسوية والأدب الإنجليزي، وكتبت نصوصا كثيرة في الدراسات النسوية وفي الأدب الأفرو أمريكي. دكتور دايو غور مدير مؤسس للبرنامج الدراسات السوداء، مؤرخة للنضال النسوي ومن أجل الحرية، الكفاح التحرري الأسود. الدكتور جيرالد هورن هو بروفيسور في التاريخ أو في التاريخ الأمريكي الأفريقي وأيضا مهتم بالدراسات والحقوق الإنسانية وحقوق العمال، وهو مؤلف أكثر من 30 كتابا، بما في ذلك كتاب عن العلاقات الأفريقية أو الأمريكية والجنوب أفريقية، ودراسة مميزة عن الجاز. دكتور روبن كالي هو مؤلف كتب كثيرة، بما في ذلك كتاب عن التقليد الجذري أو التقاليد الجذرية السوداء، وكتب بشكل واسع جدا عن المقاطعة وعن فلسطين وعن الصهيونية. إذن السؤال: كيف أتيتم إلى هنا؟ ما هو تاريخكم الثقافي؟ بدقائق معدودة. أنجيلا ديفيس قالت بعد الترحيب وبأنها تشعر بالفخر لكونها معنا، تحدثت عن أن خلفيتها هي في النظرية النقدية في الفلسفة منذ الستينيات من القرن الماضي. هي تعتبر أن المعرفة مهمة لحثنا على أن نتصور عوالم جديدة وعوالم أفضل، مثل الديمقراطية والاشتراكية. على الناس العاديين كما تقول أن يتضامنوا، أن يتعاونوا من أجل خلق حركات جمعية قوية، على ما تعلمت من الأوضاع الفصل العنصري في الجنوب الأمريكي. طردت من وظيفتها التعليمية الأولى لأنها كانت عضوا في الحزب الشيوعي الأمريكي، وكانت هي سجينة سياسية. هي
لما كانت سجينة
حين كانت سجينة سياسية، وهي أيضا كانت ناشطة في عدد كبير من الحملات، بما في ذلك حملة من أجل التضامن مع السجناء السياسيين الفلسطينيين الذين هربوا رسائل إليها من السجون الإسرائيلية حين كانت أنجيلا في السجن. هي تقول إن كل شخص في حركة التحرر السوداء في السبعينيات كان يعرف الشعر الفلسطيني، وتحديدا قصيدة سميح القاسم يا عدو الشمس. هي الروابط بين حركة التحرر السوداء وحركة التحرر الفلسطينية تعود إلى عقود طويلة ماضية، ولقد تعلم، ودروس الكفاح النضالي علم الكثيرين وعلمها أن تفكر عميقا في النضال التحرري الأسود، بما في ذلك إلغاء نظام السجون. بيفرلي هي نتاج العنصرية القبيحة الأبرتايدية في الجنوب الأمريكي. نشأت في عائلة من الناشطين السياسيين، ومن المهم أيضا أن نذكر أنها هي جاءت إلى جامعة سبيلمان سنة 1962، وهي جامعة يعني عريقة في النضال الأسود من أجل النسوة أيضا. وهي يعني وقد مشت في مظاهرة مع مارتن لوثر كينغ، وكانت تعرفه كوزير
لا
مينستر
قسيس.
هي تلميذة المؤرخ الأمريكي الكبير هاوردزن ومؤرخين آخرين، وكانت هذه بداية عملها الثقافي. هي ناضلت كنسوية سوداء، وبعد 100 عام من النضال داخل جامعة سبيلمان استطاعت هذه الجامعة أن تحظى برئيسة، يعني رئيسة امرأة سوداء، وكانت أيضا يعني راديكالية، كانت جذرية، مش إنه أي رئيسة سوداء. وتقول إنه قد كان حاسما في تطورها الفكري أنها قد انخرطت في العمل من أجل فلسطين، وهذا أدى إلى أن تكون جامعة سبيلمان الجامعة السوداء الأولى التي كان لديها فرع لمنظمة أو لحركة طلاب من أجل العدالة في فلسطين، Students for Justice in Palestine. دكتور دايو غور هي تقول إن تجربتها العميقة الثقافية بدأت كبنت كفتاة سوداء في ميشيغان في السبعينيات والثمانينات من القرن الماضي، السياسة بالنسبة لها كانت أساسا حول القوة السوداء، التحرر الأسود والكرامة السوداء، كرامة الشعب الأسود. انخراطها كان في جامعة في شيكاغو، وهناك تعلمت يعني الجذرية في السياسة. طالبت مثلا بأن تطرد CIA من بحملة طرد CIA من الحرم الجامعي، وهي انخرطت ضد حرب الخليج، الحرب الأمريكية العدوانية في الخليج، وضد الاحتلال الإسرائيلي، وأيضا عملت في التحالف ضد وحشية البوليس منذ منتصف التسعينيات وصاعدا. تعلمت كيف تبني أيضا التضامن بين عدة مجموعات من أعراق مختلفة، وتعلمت كيف تنظم، وتعلمت أن التنظيم العمل السياسي قد لا ينتج نصرا، ومع ذلك فإن هذا النضال قد سيكون له أثر عميق في كيفية التنظيم وفي كيفية التضامن. دكتور جيرالد هورن جذوره هي في قلب ميسيسيبي، قلب الظلام العنصري في الولايات المتحدة. إذن هو ولد وترعرع في جنوب العنصري الأمريكي. هو محام اليوم في مدينة نيويورك. ذهب إلى بيروت وقابل ياسر عرفات قبل أن يرحل عرفات إلى تونس. هو يرى أن النشاط ضعف لعدم فهم الناس ما يجري في الولايات المتحدة بالحقيقة، لأنه لم يفهموا أن الولايات المتحدة تعني الكولونيالية الاستيطانية settler colonialism، وهو قد بحث كثيرا ونشر كثيرا عن العلاقة بين الإمبراطورية العثمانية وبين الاستيطانية الكولونيالية والعبودية في الولايات المتحدة. أخيرا دكتور روبن كيلي، والمش أخيرا ما قبل أخير، روبن جبران كيلي، هو يقول إنه الآن أمام 125 عاما من النضال الذي يخوضه الضيوف الكرام. هو ولد في بداية الستينيات في هارلم في مدينة نيويورك من مهاجرة أو الروحية مش هيك؟ من جامايكا. في السبعينيات انتقل إلى كاليفورنيا وتعاطى مع الأزمات الاقتصادية الكونية، وكان له نشاط جذري سياسي في الثمانينات داخل الجامعة ضمن وفي قلب حقبة النيوليبرالية اليمينية، ولكن وهو أيضا عضو في حزب ماركسي يساري متجذر في مفهوم التضامن الأممي، وهو أيضا كان انخرط في العمل من أجل دعم الانتفاضة الأولى الفلسطينية طبعا سنة 1987، وفي حملات معادلة الحرب ضد غرناطة وضد بنما، وهذا ما دفعه إلى أن يصبح مؤرخا. فلسطين بالنسبة إليه كانت يعني صدمته حين زارها للمرة الأولى سنة 2012 ضمن وفد في حملة المقاطعة الأكاديمية والثقافية لإسرائيل، وتعلم أن الكولونيالية تعلم كيف تكون الكولونيالية في أماكن أخرى غير الولايات المتحدة، وبحث وكتب عن النضالات السوداء الفلسطينية. شكرا لكم.
شكرا. Thank you so much for this incredible summary in very short time, and I have to tell my colleagues, thank you so much. This is really great. Okay, so just to go back to the follow-up on the discussion that we're doing. So I was actually thinking about, first of all, we could also switch the order if it's okay with you, so we don't have people. It's your choice, okay? But I was thinking, this is the thoughts in terms of defining the moment. I was just thinking that if each of you could focus on a particular question Not because you can't speak about everything, but because I'm the one who's moderating, so I'm reminded by some of the work you're doing. So I was just hoping that maybe Gerald, you can speak about the whole question of the connection between settler colonialism, white supremacy, and specifically your work around the Declaration of Independence. And what does that mean? Because also for our people don't like, the United States, I have to say, United States embassies do a very good job of trying to present a lot of propaganda, which made segue to some of the work you do, Dayo, on the whole question of how they send ambassadors and so on and so forth. But you really don't, this is one thing to kind of like talk about that. That's one thing. I was thinking that maybe, Robin, you can speak about the whole question of gentrification and the whole question, I mean, you're the one who wrote about Harlem when it was getting emptied and so on. And how does that connect to the moment today? And how does the whole question of the political economy and racial capitalism connect with that? And of course, you can drop anything I say and not talk about it at all, whatever you want. Angela, I was thinking maybe if you would actually share with us what happened with the Montgomery Award that was rescinded, and then you were actually able to get it. But if you can also give a shout out to Assata Shakur, talk about what's happening with her, because you also were part of that campaign. And I was thinking that Dayo, maybe you can speak about the whole, the chasing and the attacks against the left and the neo-McCarthyism. And McCarthyism at that time, that basically, actually, and specifically in the case, you can speak about everybody. You can speak about the case of the women, of the Black radical women and other women of color who will actually this has been very much a part of them, especially because we're seeing more policing that's going on. And Beverly, I was thinking about maybe you can speak a little bit about the history of the women's movement coming to the 100th anniversary of the suffrage and the relationship between the women on the Seneca and IWS and the question of lynching. I just wanted to mention one more thing that I keep thinking more and more and more about Stuart Hall and policing the crisis. Like all the stuff that's coming on today is very, so anyway, whoever would like to start, please take it away. And you can also comment on each other's comments and so on. And obviously there are a lot of things that we've already covered, so we can move on. So anybody who would like to start, please go ahead. Okay, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead. Anybody. Angela, do you want to go first? It's your choice.
Well,
okay.
I can, but all right.
Or do you want to wait? I mean, if you want to wait, maybe Gerald, you can talk about the Declaration of Independence. And okay.
Yeah, I thought it would be good for Gerald to begin.
Okay.
Well, settler colonialism, a phenomenon that folks in historic Palestine are quite familiar with. However, it's not a term, even in progressive and radical circles, that's generally invoked in the United States of America, even though it's an exemplar of a settler colonial project, particularly in the English phase, when in 1607, English settlers across class lines crossed the Atlantic to settle in the land they call Virginia, named after Queen Elizabeth, the supposed Virgin Queen, and began a process of expropriating indigenous land, which then culminates in a settlers' revolt in 1776, led by real estate speculator #1, George Washington, led by slaveholders such as Thomas Jefferson, the purported author of the so-called Declaration of Independence, supposedly talking about all men created equal, even though he owned many hundreds of enslaved Africans, and not to mention the woman with whom he fathered children, who of course was many years younger than himself, to put it mildly. Now, settler colonialism is important because settler colonialism usually involves class collaboration. That is to say, poor Europeans being sponsored by richer Europeans to cross the Atlantic, with the bargain being that the poor Europeans can come out on the winning end if they're able to get the land of the indigenous population. And with some luck and quite a bit of pluck, they could then get enslaved Africans to work that land and accomplish the so-called American dream. I will only mention in conclusion that settler revolts historically have been problematic. In your part of the world, I'm sure you're familiar with the settlers' revolt in Algeria in the late 1950s, early 1960s, which in some ways exceeded the settlers' revolt in North America, insofar as they were not only seeking to seize the land, but also to overthrow the regime in Paris of the settler colonial force. I'm not familiar with the settlers in North America seeking to overthrow the regime in London, for example. Then there's a settlers' revolt in what is now Zimbabwe, November 1965, when the European minority says explicitly that they're walking in the footsteps of 1776, seeking to forestall African majority rule, one person, one vote, just as in 1776, the settlers led by George Washington thought that abolition was on the way per Somerset's case in London in 1772, portrayed in the film Belle, B-E-L-L-E, which you may want to watch. Also, a rebellion against the Royal Proclamation of 1762, where London expressed displeasure at continuing to move west, expending blood and treasure, seizing the land of Native Americans and turning it over to real estate speculators like George Washington. These material forces, not these high-flown ideas of liberty, which by the way, did not apply to a significant percentage of the population in any case, is these material forces that led to the overthrow of British rule and the construction of the United States of America and the continuation of class collaboration, which arguably had its most recent manifestation during the November 2016 election, when a faux billionaire was able to mobilize 63 million voters on his behalf. Certainly, it's mathematically impossible for 63 million to be part of the 1% in a nation of 330 million. So I'll stop there and leave it to my colleagues.
I'm going to actually maybe segue to Beverly because we're talking about the whole question of the women's movement, but I actually wanted to just add a couple of points that actually Zionist theorizers did also look to settler colonialism in the US and talked about it, like Jabotinsky and so on. And also there is the whole question of Trump also supporting the white settlers in South Africa and claiming that the people who are trying to claim their lands are going around killing whites, which is another one of the lies that were going on. But if we can move now to Beverly and talk about some of these leaders of the women's movement and so on who actually signed anti-slavery declaration, then they came to the US and did things very differently. And maybe you can also speak a little bit about Frederick Douglass, since also some of his statues have been toppled by right-wing forces. So I think would be an important thing to note as well. So please.
Okay, I'm going to try to be really brief. So the first thing that we have to do is to disrupt the traditional white feminist narrative of the women's movement in the US, which supposedly begins in 1848 with the Seneca Falls. So we have to just throw that away. And so when I think about the women's movement in the US, I began with indigenous women, particularly Haudenosaunee, who lived in New York. And those were the women, those indigenous women, those are the women from whom white suffragists learned that it was possible to have a world without patriarchy. So I begin there. The other thing that I do is I talk about enslaved women who are not usually considered to be part of any women's movement. And I talk about the fact that enslaved African-American women practiced body autonomy when they did something as extreme as infanticide. So this whole notion of where does reproductive rights come from, that doesn't come much later. That's enslaved women trying to have control over their bodies. That's women's movement. If we go to Ida Wells's anti-lynching crusade, that's women's movement, even though it doesn't get conceptualized as women's movement. And one of the—
I'm sorry, can you just explain who Ida B. Wells is for the audience?
Okay, the anti-lynching crusade that Ida Wells catalyzed had as its core notion that the criminalization of African-American men was based on this notion of pure white womanhood. So that means that she had already a race gender construct. So anti-lynching for her, she wanted to make visible the fact that the construction of white womanhood as pure, and that was the explanation for the lynching of Black men, was totally bullshit. And in fact, she talked about voluntary liaisons between white women and Black men, which freaked out white male journalists. So you have to reposition the anti-lynching crusade out of its narrow race construct and think about it as a movement that understood the intersections between race, class, and gender. So that's her. And of course, we have to also say that you would not have had a so-called women's movement if you hadn't had an abolitionist movement. All of those suffragists were originally abolitionists. And let me just talk about Frederick Douglass for just a minute. He almost never gets positioned as a suffragist. Frederick Douglass was the only Black person in Seneca Falls in 1848. He was the one who pushed those white suffragists to be more radical. And he was the one that said, you got to really talk about the connections between white supremacy and patriarchy. And so Frederick Douglass is extremely important in terms of anti-racism, but he's also extremely important in terms of what we think of as women's movement. Though even in African-American studies, we don't always position Frederick Douglass in that way. So I'm happy that you mentioned Frederick Douglass, even though there are lots of debates about whether he was in fact, whether there was a not dissonance between his ideology and his practice, but we have to claim him also as a woman suffrage man.
Yes, yes. And the fact that he actually, on July 5th, he would actually read the proclamation.
Oh, absolutely.
The toppling of the statue, his statues actually happened on that day.
And we know him
we
know him primarily. We know Frederick Douglass primarily as that person who penned that eloquent anti-July 4th statement, but we don't know him with respect to his commitment to a women's emancipation to the same extent.
How about we go to you, Robin, and talk about racial capitalism and gentrification and the disposition of certain lands and people.
Right. Okay, in 3 minutes.
Sorry.
I'm going to say just a couple of things. One, just, we think of gentrification, the other term that people like Ruth Wilson Gilmore and Ananya Roy use is sort of organized abandonment, which is a very specific strategy of dispossessing resources from a community, which then is open season, kind of terra nullius, for its transformation into value and wealth. And so when we think about gentrification, it's a global phenomenon. I mean, cities all over the world are, experiencing this process of both organized abandonment and transformation of the land, the dispossession of people from that land, transforming into value. And those same people end up being, low-wage labor. But it's inseparable from the question of segregation. And this is the thing I think is even really important, that residential segregation and wealth inequality is key to everything. We're dealing with, both globally, but specifically in the United States, 26 million people came out in protests against police violence to call for, not everyone's calling for this, but defunding the police is also about ending a system of policing in which resources go to doing the work of organized abandonment and to dominating those communities that are considered or deemed a threat through forms of policing called broken windows. And that's, again, inseparable from the question of segregation, because we, in the United States at least, have never had a desegregation housing policy. It has never existed. We've had housing acts and other things to protect people from discrimination, but never a policy that actively meant to desegregate. On the contrary, we have zoning laws and redlining. What does that mean? It means certain strategies by the real estate industry to ensure that certain people of color cannot move into other neighborhoods, that certain neighborhoods remain white, and not just white, but remain segregated and sources of wealth, where the value of the homes, the value of property, the value of rental properties continue to rise by virtue of the fact of who lives there, versus those places where they decline, along with things like tax revenues, property tax revenues. And, so in many ways, if you connect residential segregation and gentrification or organized abandonment, everything else follows. The value of the school districts, whether that schools work, how you police. Over-policing are in those communities with fewer resources. Access to jobs, access to transportation. And all those things follow when you can transform that community that's been victim of organized abandonment into spaces of value, and that's gentrification. And that is, again, at the heart of so much of what we think of as the way capitalism operates in the Western world.
And you people may want to look up, Robin had just published an op-ed in the New York Times not long ago, a whole challenging the whole notion of looting and what does it mean and what does, I don't know if you want to say something about that or you choose.
No. I mean, looting is colonialism. That's not to say that there are other things that don't happen, which we could talk about, but that to me is a different conversation. I can make a link though very quickly between looting as part of the process of organized abandonment of basically taking people's land and property, and the fact that corporate interests and government interests always work together on these things. And we have laws, not just in the United States, but elsewhere, that allow the state to just seize property for no other reason that they need it, and they don't really need it. Oftentimes it's about creating opportunities for capital investment, for infrastructure, and for the creation of opportunities for creating value in those spaces.
I was thinking that maybe we can go, if it's okay, I was saying Angela first, but maybe Dayo, to talk about the linkages, about the whole question of when there is a movement that's rising, that actually challenges all of these injustices, we start seeing the power of the state trying to crush it. I mean, of course, Angela is an example of that also, not only talks about it. But I was thinking if you can actually speak about that, the movements that have risen, and the whole question of the red baiting, the McCarthyism, COINTELPRO, the multiple ways in which every single movement that rises gets crushed because the power of the state comes into it. So I was wondering, I mean, this is your research, if you can actually speak to us also from some of the examples that you include in your work and whatever else you want to say.
Sure, I'd be honored to. I just wanted to say one thing because Beverly's comment made me think about actually Ida B. Wells' anti-lynching campaign, which really hit its peak when she was able to travel abroad and spread and talk about that, was made possible because of support of Frederick Douglass. They had a fraught relationship, but he wrote the introductory letter to allow her to have access to these communities of abolitionists and suffragist activists in England, where she went. And that sort of, as she was being pushed out of the South by lynch mobs, she was able to go there and really continue the campaign. So you can see sort of the connections of his work around those things, which I think are important, which is also part of some of the work I'm doing. But I think this question of movements and sort of the backlash that comes, and I think we can see already how that's building in this moment is really important. And I would say one thing in the positive of how movements resist this, that in this moment, what I really recognize, thinking about sort of my work on activists in the 40s and 50s, is the ways in which this moment is possible right now because of all the work, the decades, the years of activism and organizing that communities and grassroots groups have been doing locally, building national, international solidarity efforts across the US, but also globally, that around this idea of anti-Blackness, challenging state-sanctioned violence, and sometimes doing that work with very little sort of notable victories or spectacular sort of wins, but carrying it on. And that has sort of made, I think, possible this moment where we see this explosion and sort of a real shift in the conversation and discourse where New York Times is talking about abolitionist politics, where there really is a moment that we can see newscasters using the word white supremacy, right? That I think those moments matter, and I think they are owed to the sustained activism that often happens I think Robin referenced like during the 80s, where it doesn't seem like a moment where you will have a victory, right? And I think that's true of the activists in the 50s who were doing a lot of this work amidst the Red Scare. And I really think about one of the figures in these moments that really, I think, set an important tone is Beulah Richardson, also known as Bea Richards. And if you want to know more, Lisa Gay Hamilton has a great documentary film on her called Bea, A Black Woman Speaks, and she has actually publications. But she was really active in the Civil Rights Congress and with William Patterson, who Gerald Horn has written a lot about, and did a lot of work to sort of mobilize and support Black defendants who are caught up in the criminal justice system. And then in 1951, she wrote this really powerful piece, this poem called Genocide, that was written sort of in support of the genocide, we charged genocide position that the Civil Rights Congress, which was a left-leaning, but Black sort of led with William Patterson as head and a number of African-American women active in it, organization that was mobilizing around these campaigns to support Black defendants. And then one of its, I think out of a frustration, right? Because during the 50s, much of its organizing was seen as marginal. They were under profound government surveillance. In 1951, when she writes the poem, you can see Claudia Jones, who's one of the biggest theorists in the Communist Party, a Black woman who talks
left of Karl Marx.
Left of Karl Marx, exactly. The best book title, right? Because she is placed in a cemetery to the left of Karl Marx in her resting place. That it's really a moment of the left under attack and the Black left under attack. Paul Robeson cannot leave to even support the UN petition of charge genocide. And she writes this poem out of frustration because she is organized around these campaigns and seen many people killed, right? That they're threatened with execution by the state, and the state executes them. They're getting very few victories, and it's called Genocide. And I'll just read you a piece of it. It goes, "And my pain is unended, for this government policy towards me is ever changing but unchanged. It kills me. By government policy I am slain. Maimed, slaughtered, lynched, framed. It kills me. This American democracy, it kills me." And I think about that moment because she's writing in a moment where it really is clear, I think, to many of them that they won't have a victory. And soon after, the Civil Rights Congress is closed down. But if you fast forward 5 years, 10 years, she's in a Broadway play, Raising the Sun, read by Lorraine Hansberry. Their global connections, right? Their continued efforts to think about their work in solidarity with anti-colonial and anti-imperialist struggles, particularly in the Global South, start to bear fruit. You see their connections as a root for a third world solidarity movement that explodes in the 60s and 70s. So I think even when the state comes down hard on them, and it really does, it deports Claudia Jones. Many of the figures go into jail. Bea Richards for a while can't find employment. So they really struggle at the hands of this, but their commitment to sustaining through that, I think they don't see the immediate victory, but I think it does lay an important sort of groundwork for their sustained activism and the real explosion that happens in the 60s and 70s, and a way for them to engage that even as older activists, to remain relevant in that movement, even as older activists. And I think that's an important thing, even as you face state repression, which is the response, right? Frederick Douglass says, power concedes nothing. And so I think that is an important sort of strategy to think about how you sustain in these moments and the lessons we can learn from moments where people are not victorious, but they are sustained, they are in collective community, they are still organized. And maybe that doesn't fully answer the question, but it's definitely over 3 minutes.
Thank you. Angela, I was wondering if you can, and I mean, you're a model, you embody a lot of the things that we're actually talking about. And so I was wondering if you can speak a little bit about somebody like Assata Shakur, who's actually faced all of this stuff in prison and continues to have $2 million award on her life. But also I would really like you, if you can speak a little bit about what we thought might have been defeat with the Montgomery Award. And then we had a victory about it. So if you can actually speak about this,
Well, yes, of course, the movement to free Assata Shakur, which has a very, very long history, has helped both to stage the current moment and to insist on the kind of internationalism and of course, Palestine has been at the very center of the development of an internationalist perspective within the Black movement. I was offered the Fred Shuttlesworth Human Rights Award by the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute not quite 2 years ago. And shortly before I was scheduled to go to Birmingham to receive the award, I received a phone call from members of the board informing me that they had decided to retract the award. I learned later that that rescission came as a result of their learning about my activism around Palestine, which was on the record. I mean, I've been involved in struggles for solidarity with Palestine for the vast majority of my life. I don't see how they missed that when they first decided to offer me the award. But in any event, that came in the context of attacks on Mark Lamont Hill and other Black activists. What was important was that a very expansive conversation about the relationship between struggles against racism and the struggle for a free Palestine emerged. And a couple of weeks ago, there was a virtual program in which the BCRI actually gave me the award in the context of a complete reorganization of the leadership of the Institute in conjunction with community people and the city government, all of whom had been opposed to the decision of the Institute to rescind the award. But let me say something perhaps more general about the way in which the conjuncture of the pandemic that we are experiencing helped to create a rising structural awareness of racism and a context for a very different kind of response to the killing of George Floyd and the lynching, the police lynching of George Floyd and the racist police murder of Breonna Taylor. And I want to say this because I don't think that the response would have been what it was without explicit connections with on-the-ground Palestine resistance in Palestine. First of all, the emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement in the aftermath of the killing of the vigilante racist killing of Trayvon Martin was very much shaped by a Palestine-centered internationalism, from the Dream Defenders to the Black Lives Network and movement. And solidarity with Palestine has helped to shape a new anti-racist and anti-capitalist feminism, what some of us call abolition feminism. The debates around whether Palestine is a feminist issue have shaped such movements as the Women's March. Palestinian American activist Linda Sarsour has played a major leadership role in this respect. And of course, we're also deeply grateful to you, Rabab, and to Noura Erakat and many others. The case of Razmia O'Day helped us to think more deeply about the role of the state in perpetuating gender violence and its relationship to state violence. So the point that I'm trying to make is that solidarity with Palestine has helped to steer contemporary movements away from the notion that all we need to do is to try, all we need to do in response to police killings. And of course, the entire history of the Black presence in this part of the world has been one of that kind of repression. But we can't simply assume that we need to arrest and try and convict individual police officers who assault and kill Black people, people of color. We've learned from the struggle in Palestine about the structural dimensions of policing and its reliance on racism. For example, militarization of the police, the ways in which the Israeli military has trained police departments all over the US and indeed all over the world. The ways in which Islamophobia on a global scale has shaped contemporary racism directed against Black, Indigenous, Latinx communities. And so we've learned also to include demands, for example, to abolish ICE. When we say abolish the police, we also need to abolish the Border Patrol police. And so I think it's important in trying to understand this moment to recognize how central Palestine has been to the emergence of a radical abolitionist present today.
Thank you. I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues in Beirut, my comrades, Dr. Samah Idris and Dr. Rania Al-Masri, for translation. And then I think we're going to probably take one question before we open it up to the audience. So I would like to just leave you with it, think about it, is to think about, so we have all this knowledge and so much more outside of this virtual room and elsewhere. How do we make that accessible to other people? What do we do? How can we actually use the knowledge that we all produce collectively in the service of justice and liberation? What should we, as scholars, activists in the universities and academics and outside do? What are some of the ways we think the movement is going to go? And of course, we don't prescribe recipes for everybody, but we can basically speculate, and anything else you'd like to talk about. And let me turn it over to Samah and Rania. And thank you so much for this incredible job of doing such a great translation of such different contexts and so much stuff, and you're all distilling it together. It's amazing. Thank you so much.
ان شاء الله بتزبط هلا معنا بس. طيب السؤال الثاني طرحته رباب، ما الذي يعرف اللحظة الراهنة؟ جيرالد قال ظاهرة الكولونيالية الاستيطانية ليست مصطلحا يتحدث عنه في الولايات المتحدة عند التحدث عن فلسطين أو عند التحدث حتى عن الولايات المتحدة. عملية سرقة أراضي الشعوب الأصلية في الولايات المتحدة كما تعلمون بدأت سنة 1606 وكانت بقيادة من يملكون العبيد مثل جورج واشنطن الذي كتب عن مساواة الرجال ومساواة الناس بشكل عام، ولكنه كان يمتلك مئات من العبيد. هالمنافق يعني. الكولونيالية الاستيطانية عادة هي يعني موضوعها هو عن التعاون أو التواطؤ الطبقي. يعني الأوروبيون الفقراء كانوا يشجعون من قبل الأغنياء على عبور المحيط الأطلنطيقي من أجل الاستيلاء على الأرض من السكان الأصليين، وبعد ذلك يستعبد الأفارقة من أجل العمل في هذه الأرض المسروقة. وتكلمت أيضا عن ثورة المستوطنين في الجزائر في نهاية الخمسينيات التي تفوقت على حتى الثورة في شمال أمريكا، لأنهم كانوا يحاولون أن يطيحوا بالنظام في فرنسا نفسها. وأيضا عن الثورة في زيمبابوي في سنة 1945. والقوى المادية التي التي كانت تسرق الأرض هي التي أدت إلى الإطاحة بالحكم البريطاني وليس إلى فرض الحرية.
يعني ما كانوش، وبقولها بالدارج، ما كانوش التعابير للحرية والعدالة هو ما كانوا الأسباب اللي أدوا لما يسمى تحرير الولايات المتحدة من الحكم الإنجليزي، ولكن كان سرقة الأراضي من الأصليين واستعباد الأفريقان هو كانوا الأسباب لتحرير أو يعني
اعلان ما يسمى بالاستقلال زي ما عملوا الصهاينه بفلسطين.
ورباب هنا تدخلت وقالت ان المنظرين الصهاينه كانوا يتطلعون الى الكولونياليه الاستيطانيه في الولايات المتحده، وترامب شخصيا يدعم المستوطنين البيض في افريقيا، في جنوب افريقيا. ثم تحدثت بيفرلي عن قيادات الحركه النسائيه الذين غيروا مقارباتهم حين جئنا الى الولايات المتحده. اولا غيروا سرديه المرأة البيضاء التقليدية عن الحركة النسوية. الحركة النسائية في الولايات المتحدة بدأت مع النسوة الأصليات، يعني من النسوة اللواتي كنا يطالبن بحق التصويت. شيء
قبل أهل البلاد الأصليين، أهل البلاد الأصليين
وكانوا يتحدثون عن إمكانية خلق عالم بدون البطريركية أو بدون الأبوية. ثانياً تحدثت عن النسوة المستعبدات في وصفهن جزءاً من الحركة النسائية.
طيب كانوا هم
النسوة الأفرو أمريكي الأفريقيات الأمريكيات من أصل أفريقي المستعبدات تحدثنا عن أو يمارسن الاستقلال الجسدي عندما يتحدثون عن حقوق التناسل. حقوق التناسل،
حقوق الإنجابية،
حقوق الإنجاب. نعم.
في شغلة ثانية هي حكت عن اوكي
ايضا عن الحمله ضد شو تحدثت عن الحمله عن اللينشنج، هي الاعدام الغوغائي. يعني حين كان السود يعلقون من الشجر او
يشنقون يحرقون
او يطلق عليهم الرصاص امام مئات او امام الاف البيض، يعني واحيانا تحت دعاوى مزيفه انه والله ابتسم لامراه بيضاء او ابتسم او عاكس بمزدوجين امراه، يعدمونه رميا بالرصاص او يعلقونه بالشجر. ثم شو هون؟ وتحدثت عن ان الحمله ضد اللينشنج، ضد الاعدام الغوغائي، هو في حقيقه الامر هو عند تقاطع العرق مع الطبقة والنوع الاجتماعي أو الجندر، وليس هو مسألة عنصرية فقط، هو يأتي عند التقاطع كل هذه النواحي. ليس هناك حركة نسائية بدون
حركة التحرير
حركة التحرر من العبودية. ثم تحدثت عن فريدريك دوغلاس الذي كان الرجل الأسود الوحيد سنة 1848 الذي تحدث عن حق النساء في التصويت.
لا، اللي حضر المؤتمر مش هو الوحيد. اللي حضر المؤتمر.
اوكي، حضر المؤتمر عن حق
حضر المؤتمر عن التصويت، عن النساء البيض اللي كانوا بيطالبوا بالتصويت، مع انهم كانوا حاضرين مؤتمر ضد العنصرية، ضد العبودية. بعدين اجوا ورفضوا التحرر المتساوي للنساء وللرجال السود كمان، وطالبوا بس هم النساء يتحرروا كنساء من
الحركة النسوية ليست فقط حركة من أجل تحرر النساء، بل هي أيضا من أجل التحرر من العبودية. صح؟ فهمت علي كيف؟
هم كانوا بدهم النساء بس يصوتوا، يعني هم اللي كانوا مطالبين النساء هذا المؤتمر بس النساء البيض يصوتوا، وضحوا بحقوق الرجال السود والنساء السود وكل بس مشانهم يحصلوا حقوقهم، واللي هي زي الليبرالية النسوية يعني اللي بضلها تتكرر.
ثم روبن تحدث عن الجنتريفيكيشن. يعني الجنتريفيكيشن حين يأتي الأغنياء لشراء أراضٍ فقيرة، مش هيك؟ أو في مناطق فقيرة، خلينا رجعين عن شو اسمه، وبهذا يعني هذا يؤدي إلى إزاحة الفقراء من هذه الأحياء. organized abandonment الهجرة المنظمة وهي استراتيجية محددة لسلب المصادر من الناس ووضعها في تصرف أشخاص أغنياء أو أشخاص آخرين يعني في تصرفهم. وهذه نعم تفضل يا رباب.
يعني هم اللي بيصير اللي صار مثلا بثورات الستينات، بتصير الثورات بهربوا البيض من الاماكن، بضلوا الناس الملونين. بتصير بتيجي الحكومه بتقول انها هاي المناطق ما بتسوى، ما عندها ريال استيت فاليو، ما بتسوى. بيجوا بتركوها لفتره مهمله، بعدين بيجي رؤوس الاموال اللي هم عندهم اللي بيطلعوا مثل سيليكون فالي والتعاون الامن والى اخره وكذا، بيشتروا الاراضي كلياتها وبيغيروا بيبنوا كوندومينيومز وهيك شغلات، وبطروا كل الناس من اراضي. فهي مترابطه بالعرق ومترابطه بالعنصريه ومترابطه بالانفتاح.
وهي تقول انه هذه جنتريفيكيشن هذه ظاهره عالميه. يعني اذا بدكم هيك انا اذا بدك مثلا كيف هلا صاير بالغبير ببيروت، انه هي كانت فقيره الان صارت الشقه بمليون وبمليونين واكثر. اللامساواه في الثروه لا يمكن فصلها عن الفصل العرقي في السكن. residential segregation، فصل عرقي في السكن. 26 مليون شخص تظاهروا ضد، ايضا هنا نتحدث عن تظاهر 26 مليون ضد وحشيه الشرطه من اجل انهاء نظام الشرطه والرقابه التي تتحكم بهذه الجاليات التي ينظر اليها من قبل الشرطه كتهديد. وهذا لا يمكن فصله عن الفصل السكاني. ليست هناك سياسة في الولايات المتحدة لمنع هذا الفصل السكاني. ليست هناك سياسة أمريكية لمنع أو لوقف هذا الفصل السكاني. بالعكس، السياسات الأمريكية تضمن الفصل العرقي في السكن، وتضمن الحصول الفصل العرقي في توزيع الثروة. كل شيء يتبع هذا الفصل العرقي وهذه اللامساواة في الثروة في الولايات المتحدة، بما في ذلك الحصول على الوظائف والدخول إلى المدارس وحتى وسائل التنقل. هذا هو جوهر عمل الرأسمالية في الولايات المتحدة، وهي تربط بين الاستيلاء على أرض الناس وعلى ثرواتهم وبين مصالح الحكومة عبر الاستيلاء، عبر فرض قوانين للاستيلاء على الملكية. دايو تحدثت عندما تنهض الحركات لتحدي الظلم تأتي سلطة الدولة لتقمع هذه الحركات، ونحن نرى ذلك يتراكم اليوم. لكن الناحية الإيجابية هنا أن نعترف وأن ندرك أن اللحظة اليوم ممكنة بسبب عقود من التراكم للتنظيم المحلي وعلى امتداد الولايات المتحدة والتضامن الأممي من أجل تحدي العنف الذي ترخصه وتديره الدولة. إن الاستعلائية البيضاء white supremacy يتحدث عنها اليوم يتحدث عنها في برامج الأخبار في الولايات المتحدة، يعني ما عاد شيء محصور بفئة معينة متطرفة. وتتحدث أيضا عن شعراء يساريين الذين يهاجمون اليوم، وتحدث عن قصيدة معينة بعنوان Genocide أو الإبادة، التي تتحدث عن سياسة أمريكية لا متناهية من الإبادة. حتى الدولة اليوم دولة يعني تضرب بقسوة على الشعراء اليساريين، ولكن رغم ذلك فإن التزام هؤلاء الشعراء استمر رغم هذا القمع، وأدى إلى تشكيل ركائز نقدية قوية من أجل تدعيم الحركة الناشطة بالستينات والسبعينات في الولايات المتحدة. هذه الدروس علينا أن نتعلمها، وهي أن الناس قد لا ينتصرون، ولكنهم مع ذلك يدعمون ويواصلون النضال. أنجيلا تجسد رباب تعرف الآن عن أنجيلا وتقول إنها تمثل كثيرا من القضايا التي نتحدث عنها الآن. هي
سئلت
عن أساتة شكور
التي بعد هلا مطلوبة من المخابرات الأمريكية، وهي بعد هلا مناضلة، يعني في حركة
على راسها $1,000,000 على راسها الاف بي اي طالب $1,000,000.
في حركة دولية وفي الولايات المتحدة لتحرير أساتة شكور.
حركة لتحرير أساتة شكور ساعدت على بناء أممية نقدية، وكانت في قلب هذه الأمم النقدية فلسطين التي هي في قلب المقاربات الأممية داخل الحركة التحرر السوداء. وتحدثت أنجيلا عن جائزة سحبت منها لأن من سحب هذه الجائزة منها علموا أنها ناشطة من أجل فلسطين، مع أنها ناشطة من أجل فلسطين في غالبية سنوات حياتها. يعني الآن هناك تركيز شديد على من يناصر فلسطين في الولايات المتحدة. ثم تحدثت عن أن ذلك هو جزء من سياق الهجوم على ناشطين سود يناضلون من أجل فلسطين، بما في ذلك شخص اسمه مارك لامنتيل. بشكل أعم هناك وعي بنيوي للعرقية يجري بناؤه اليوم، بما في ذلك رفض القتل الغوغائي الذي تسميه قتل غوغائي مثل اللينشينج الذي كان يتم منذ مئات السنين، الذي جرى لجورج فلويد ولآخرين مثل برايونا تايلور وغيرها. وأن الرد لم يكن ليكون بمثل هذه الحدة لو لم تكن هناك صلات واضحة مع القضية الفلسطينية. إن التضامن مع فلسطين قد ساعد على صياغة نسوية تحررية جديدة، New Liberation Feminism، وحالة رسمية عودة تبين دور الدولة في تأبيد في دعم العنف بشكل أوضح. العلاقة بين فلسطين قد حرك تحليلا أعمق لمسألة قتل الشرطة الذي يتم، يعني القتل الذي تمارسه الشرطة في الولايات المتحدة من أجل الغوص عميقا إلى مطالبة بمحاكمة رجال الشرطة في الولايات المتحدة الذين أدوا إلى هذه أعمال القتل.
ما بدهم المبدأ الأساسي بالولايات المتحدة اللي تعلموه من النضال بفلسطين، إنه يجب ما بس نكون عم نحاكم الشرطة كفرد، ولكن لازم نطلع بالشرطة بأمريكا كمؤسسة بحد ذاتها، اللي هي مؤسسة
كنظام. أيوة
بالضبط، وكنظام يعني institutionalized، نظام من أسسه عنده علاقة مميزة مع العسكر بالولايات المتحدة، مع العسكر بفلسطين المحتلة، وعنده يعني علاقة مميزة مع أنواع العنصرية القانونية وليست قانونية ضد الإسلام والمسلمين والأشخاص اللي يعتبرون ملونين people of color بالولايات المتحدة. فالقضية أكبر بكتير من محاكمة الفرد، ولكن هي بدها تكون محاكمة مؤسسة، وهذا اللي تعلموها من القضية الفلسطينية تعلموها بالولايات المتحدة.
ولذلك صارت المطالبات الآن ليست فقط من أجل إلغاء مؤسسة السجن أو مؤسسة الشرطة، بل أيضا من أجل إلغاء شرطة الحدود التي تمارس النظام العنصري والعرقي ضد المهاجرين. وفي قلب هذه النقاش وفي قلب هذه الحركة فلسطين دوما وأبدا.
شكرا. Thank you so much. We do have very little time left. So I wanted to say something. Somebody actually has been talking about the time it's taking to translate in Arabic. One of the problems that we should really be having is having resources for captioning. So we can have on the same screen captioning in English for people who are hearing impaired, as well as in Arabic. However, just so people would know, we are operating on zero budget because we've got no resources from our institutions. So we're really trying to do the best that we can by bringing all these audiences together. We are so fortunate that these amazing scholar activists actually have taken time from their busy schedule and said they're going to be with us today. So please bear with us. Let's also not be very ethnocentric about only being in English and so on. Let's just think that there is the rest of the world outside of the United States borders. It's not one place only. Okay, I'm going to ask for a couple of things. One is if we can take a little bit time so we can actually translate the last part. And I want to connect. There is one question that I want to connect it with the question I asked you already before. But before we do that, I wanted to just announce the next conversation. The next roundtable is going to be on August 19th, Tuesday, exactly at the same time. And the title of it is Black, Brown, and Indigenous Liberation, Reparations and Resistance in Settler Colonialism, White Supremacy, Militarization, and the Police State. And the people who are going to confirmed speakers include Lupe Carrasco Cardena, who is organizing on the 50th anniversary of the Chicano moratorium. If you don't know, you will know on the 19th of August. The second person is Emery Douglass, former Minister of Culture of the Black Panther Party. The third person is Oscar Lopez Rivera, the long-term freed Puerto Rican prisoner. The fourth person is Madonna Thunderhawk, the leader and co-founder of the American Indian Movement and Standing Rock Warrior Women. And the last person is Claude Marks, co-founder of the Freedom Archives and maker of the film Cointilpro and other historical documents. So this is the second conversation, August 19th. Please join us, be there or be square. And I'm going to turn it over. This is an expression I learned from the US. I'm going to turn it over to our speakers to actually, one of the questions that, the question that has been asked, which I think also can be combined, and then you will have the last word, except for the translation. How do we use the connections between African American, Indigenous, and Palestinians and other people, I assume, at this time to make something powerful out of understanding each other's struggles? What's the next step of bring them all together to get stronger, and how important to our generation to realize that? Of course, short of having international meetings and so on, like the World Festival on Youth and Socialism and so on. In this present day, what are, and I also asked you about if you can also talk about the whole question of the role of the scholarship, intellectuals, the academy, and how do we do that? How do we do it in order for us to push and contribute to these movements that are there? So whoever wants to start, I'm sorry to press you, very short time, because also Samah and Rania need to translate so our audience in the Arab world can understand that. Okay, Ruben, go ahead. Yes, please go ahead.
I'm willing to start.
Sure. Thank you.
And because time is short, I'm gonna basically kind of crush those questions together. I can't, and I don't know how to answer the question of where do we go, because I think that question is being answered right now in the streets. But just to say, you know, to think about what this moment is, this is a moment where we got to remember we've had a decade of rebellion. The 2020 rebellion is not, you know, the beginning. It's like it's culmination of a decade of rebellion, which I would argue is a response that the decade of authoritarianism is a response to that rebellion. And so it's not to say that, you know, Trump's election was some kind of turning point, but that in fact, when you look at it globally, this authoritarian turn was response to a political crisis created by, you know, neoliberalism, opposition to austerity, opposition to economic inequality, opposition to war and displacement, opposition to ongoing racism, gender and sexual oppression, and new forms of colonialism, and the destruction of the planet. So that said, I think that the question of where do we go, how we build solidarity is actually tied to the question of knowledge. I used to think, you know, we have all this knowledge in the academy and how do we make it available? I think it's the other way around. I think what we're witnessing now is the fact that there's been work, collaboration between, you know, people organizing, scholar activists and others who really built a dynamic way of thinking about the world. I mean, you know, I'm so glad we have Angela on this panel because more than any other person, you know, her work is responsible because she's always been connected to grassroots organizations. And in fact, you walk around, I remember walking around on the subway train and seeing all these people reading Are prisons obsolete? Reading Abolition, Democracy, and more recently, people walking around the streets reading Freedom is a Constant Struggle. That's not an accident. It's not an accident that groups like the Let Us Breathe Collective and We Charge Genocide and Movement for Black Lives and all those young people that Angela writes about in Ferguson gave us a model of sustained revolt dedicated to ending police violence and dismantling structural racism. And they didn't have to read a book about that. You know, they were reading, but a lot of people were actually challenging prevailing wisdom in the streets, saying, you know, these particular theories are not ours, we're making our own. So the combination, the synergy of that relationship produced things like the Movement for Black Lives document, the Vision of Black Lives policy statement, which really, you know, in some ways is the embodiment of these demands for abolition. And finally, I just want to, hopefully, you know, people will know that I know Angela and Gina Dent and others, Beth Ritchie are working on this book, I believe called Abolition Feminism. I'll let Angela talk about that. And to me, what we're seeing in the streets right now, in the best of the politics, the best of the organizing, is an expression of abolition feminism. That is the radical politics driving these movements. What does that mean? It means eradicating all forms of oppression and exploitation, decolonization, ending state-sanctioned violence, replacing police, military, and prisons with like genuine human, humane, non-carceral path for safety and justice, and freeing the body from constraints of all inherited and imposed normativities, and protecting the earth. And I think that is the future we have, and that's the future that people are struggling for. And the ideas are being built in movement, not necessarily in the academy, not to say that it's not a relationship.
Okay, I guess Angela, you get to go next. Call and response.
I think Robin is much more effective. Well, thank you, Robin. Thank you so much. You know, I think I want to end by returning to the issue of internationalism and to, you know, I don't have an answer regarding where we go from here, but I do think internationalism has to be a necessary dimension of our struggle against racist, racial capitalism and heteropatriarchy. There are those who argue that anti-Black racism is a unique phenomenon and that it only affects Black people. But I think there's a lack of understanding about how struggles against racism in the US have most often involved individuals and organizations outside of the US Black community. We've already talked about Frederick Douglass and the way in which he generated international support against slavery. Ida B. Wells has been evoked for her internationalism in the campaigns against lynching. And of course, the international dimension of the Black Lives Matter campaign was galvanized by Palestinian support of the protesters in Ferguson. And I say all this to say that I don't think we have been as effective as we should have been and should be in cultivating support for the Palestinian resistance, and specifically for BDS. And I think this is going to be an absolutely essential point on the agenda for an abolitionist future, especially now that we see the threat of further annexation by Israel of the West Bank. We have to generate a resounding and collective no.
I'm going to go next to Dayo, because you also, some of the work you've done actually brings people also from different communities together, especially like the women, activists, and so on. But also, if you can speak about it as a faculty member, somebody who's actually been straddling the various words and trying to figure out how you can also affect some of the stuff in your own work, in your own teaching. And I think I would go to also Beverly and Gerald about that as well.
I would just keep it brief, and I think I take with me as a faculty member who's over the past 2 years been doing a lot of work around trying to build intellectual and political communities around Black studies in California, that in part, some of my investments is in always remaining connected to community. So I'm a member of Scholars for Social Justice, which I think is an important way for academics to not just be in conversation with themselves, right? And I think even in my work around Black studies, trying to bring in community engagement with that, not sort of that they can learn from us, but mostly for that we can learn from them and support them in ways we can. The university has resources where it does to bring these folks together and to take advantage of that where we can. But I think in this moment, one of the things that's really, I think, central, being in the academy, is to one, use those resources and make demands on the academy to sort of change the ways in which it produces and participates in state-sanctioned violence in very real ways, and the ways it produces and participates in anti-Blackness, and the ways it has produced and participated in framing a neoliberal university. And then I would say the other thing is to be engaged in something outside the academy. I do think that is where, like, I think Robin's point is so important, that we will learn what the changes are happening in the streets. They aren't happening from the university or the academics, but we can, where we can, provide our voices, our thoughts, our ideas, our sort of skills where they're asked for, and be ready for that. So I've really actually in this moment taken up a campaign of just saying yes, right? It gets me into trouble sometimes, but that has been my thing. And it has been some moments that have really pushed me, like this moment here, to really think about how my work, not just my activism, but my work, needs to engage Palestine more clearly. How do I talk about these women in the left and their engagement sort of with the Palestinian struggle, and how fraught it is for the Communist Party, right? That I think some of that work, and as I'm writing this new book on transnational activism, how do I engage those questions more? Because it's not a dominant question in the literature. So yeah,
thank you. I'm gonna call on Gerald and then have Beverly have the last one.
Well,
for
just
today.
Briefly on this theme of internationalism, just a few weeks ago, the African Union, headquartered in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, filed a petition at the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva, calling for a commission of inquiry into systemic racism in the United States of America in light of the protests. The United States lobbied furiously against this resolution and this motion, and it did not succeed on that level. However, I would like to call upon our Palestinian friends to use their influence at the United Nations, because this will be an ongoing process with regard to heightening international pressure on the United States of America. And of course, the reciprocity, of course, as has already been noted, is us intensifying our effort with regard to BDS, with regard to anti-annexationism, et cetera. And I say that's even more important because I began some time ago talking about how the Ottoman Turks underestimated this minor kingdom on the outskirts of Europe 400 years ago, 500 years ago. And then as a result, this minor kingdom became the British Empire, which helps to explain my presence in North America, and of course became the successor colonizing power in historic Palestine. Now, what's interesting is that we may be at another moment with the rise of China, and of course the United States apparently underestimated China in the 1970s, these overtures to Beijing. But even though this may bespeak a decline in the strength of US imperialism, does not necessarily augur well for us who have been driven into the dust by US imperialism, because the progressive movement is not as strong as it can be. And at a time of decline, in a time of heightened racism, there are some of us who become targets. Of course, you already see signs of this with regard to new terms like vehicular terrorism, for example, where civilians and police alike drive their cars into peaceful protesters, leading to injuries, or what's happening in Portland and maybe happening in Chicago, where authorities without any identification drag protesters into unmarked cars and taking them to who knows where. So this may
It sounds a lot like Israel, by the way.
Well, precisely, which is one of the reasons why now more than ever, we need more reciprocity, more mutuality, etc.
Beverly.
Yeah, I want to just second everybody's comments about internationalism. And I think it would really be important for us to be more knowledgeable about how fundamentally internationalist our radical Black people and radical Black organizations have been. And I'm thinking, for example, about Malcolm X going to Lebanon in 1964 and also visiting Palestinian refugee camps. I'm thinking about Stokely Carmichael moving SNCC toward an anti-Zionist and pro-Palestinian stance in the 60s. I'm thinking about Francis Beale and SNCC and the Third World Women's Alliance, where they bonded with women in Puerto Rico around reproductive justice. And I'm thinking about Tony K. Bambara, who said in the 1970s that one of the failures of the women's movement in the US was that it was not global enough. So I want to just mention, because we've mentioned one documentary, Bea Richards one, I want to mention Road to Apartheid, which is a wonderful documentary for folk to look at who may not be as knowledgeable about the Palestinian connection to apartheid in South Africa and racial apartheid in the US. So I can't imagine anything more important than us becoming more global and more aware of our history as people of African descent who always knew how important it was to be global citizens.
I'm going to turn it over to Samah and Rania. I just want to say that the 1970 statement in the New York Times was signed again in support of Palestine, was also signed by, among others, Ella Collins, Malcolm X's sister, Grace Lee and James Lee Boggs, Fran Beal, Phil Hutchins, who was the chair of SNCC at the time, Sam Anderson, and a whole bunch of others. And we actually are going to do our last roundup of the 50th anniversary of that statement on November 1st. So stay tuned. So Samah and Rania, take it away. And then we can, thank you.
اوكي، رباب تحدثت عن ندوة قادمة، عن طاولة مستديرة قادمة في 19 آب أوت يوم الثلاثاء، بيكون نفس الوقت الساعة 8:30 مساء، وهو بعنوان الأسود الأسمر والأصلي، Black, Brown and Indigenous. وهي تتضمن أيضا ناشطين يعني لامعين ومناضلين عريقين. الآن السؤال اللي سألته رباب على الضيوف: كيف نستخدم الروابط بين الأمريكيين من أصل أفريقي والسكان الأصليين من جهة، والفلسطينيين، كفاح الفلسطينيين، من أجل تدعيم وتقوية النضالات المشتركة أو النضالات على امتداد الكون. روبن كيلي أجاب السؤال: إلى أين نتجه؟ الآن يعني يجاب عليه في الشارع. هناك 10 سنوات وأكثر من العصيان ومن التمرد.
المرحلة اليمنية في سياسة الولايات المتحدة، في داخل الولايات المتحدة، يقول روبن إنها ردة فعل للمقاومة ضد القمع وضد المظالم.
إلى أين نتجه؟ هذا السؤال مرتبط بسؤال المعرفة، question of knowledge، سؤال المعرفة. اليوم هناك تعاون بين المنظمين أو الناشطين من جهة، والأكاديميين الباحثين من جهة أخرى. مثلا أنجيلا كانت على الدوام وما تزال مرتبطة بالمنظمين القاعديين اللي عندهم جراس روتس، عندهم
القاعدة الشعبية، الجماهير الشعبية.
تمام، مش القاعدة، تنظيم القاعدة طبعا. كتبها يقرأها المنظمون، وهي أيضا تكتب عن المنظمين والناشطين. إذن التحدي الحقيقي يبدأ من الشارع، وما نشهده اليوم في الشوارع هو التعبير عن التحررية النسوية أو الأبوليشن فيمينيزم، من أجل إزاحة وإنهاء كل أشكال القمع والفصل والتمييز ومن أجل إنهاء العنف الذي ترخصه الدولة وتتيحه، وإنهاء نظام السجون، وحماية الأرض، حماية البيئة. هذه الأفكار تديرها وتبنيها الحركات على الأرض وليس الأكاديميون أو ليس الأكاديميين والمثقفين. أنجيلا تشكر روبن، ثم تقول أنها تريد أن تتحدث عن قضية الأممية، الانترناشنال، التضامن الأممي أو الوحدة الأممية. الأممية هي بعد ضروري للنضال ضد الرأسمالية العنصرية وضد البطريركية أو الأبوية. إن العنصرية ضد السود تؤثر في كل الناس وليس فقط في الشعب الأسود أو في السود وحدهم. هذا الكفاح، هذا النضال يشمل الناس خارج إطار الجالية السوداء وحدها في الولايات المتحدة. يعني مش بس العنصرية تمارس ضد السود في الولايات المتحدة، بل ضد جاليات أخرى. ونحن لم نكن سنكون بهذه الفعالية لو لم نكن بنينا دعما داخل المقاومة الفلسطينية ودعم الفلسطينيين، وتحديدا دعم حركة BDS، حركة مقاطعة إسرائيل وسحب الاستثمارات منها وفرض العقوبات عليها. هذا يحتاج إلى أن يكون أو نقطة أساسية في النضال أو في المستقبل التحرري، وخصوصا بعد السياسات الإسرائيلية الساعية إلى ضم الضفة الغربية. دايو قالت إنها كفرد أكاديمي من الجامعة تحاول أن تبني أطراً يعني تضامنية ثقافية من خارج إطار الجامعة، لأنها تعتقد أن النضال عليه ألا يقتصر على الجامعة نفسها. الأكاديميون عليهم أن يتحدثوا مع الجاليات من حولهم وأن يتعلموا منهم. الأكاديميون لا يستطيعون أن يقتصروا على الحديث فيما بينهم. علينا أيضا أن نكون منخرطين في تلقي الدعم من الشارع وفي تقديم الدعم إلى الشارع. علينا أيضا أن نتحدث أكثر عن الكفاح الفلسطيني من داخل هذه النضالات. هذه قضية أساسية. جيرالد تحدث عن قضية الأممية وعن الاتحاد الأفريقي في إثيوبيا، وكيف أنه تحدث عن وجوب محاسبة أو البحث عن عن العنصرية الممنهجة في الولايات المتحدة. وجيرالد دعا أنصار فلسطين إلى أن يستخدموا تأثيرهم في الأمم المتحدة، ما بعرف تأثيرهم، بس يعني من أجل ممارسة الضغط الأممي على الولايات المتحدة. وقال أن علينا أن نشدد على دعمنا لحركة BDS، حركة مقاطعة إسرائيل وسحب الاستثمارات منها وفرض العقوبات عليها، وضد الجهود الإسرائيلية لضم الضفة الغربية. وتحدث عن عشرات الأمثلة في الولايات المتحدة التي حيث تحاول السلطة الأمريكية عبر استخدام سيارات بدون أرقام من أجل القبض على المتظاهرين. وهنا تتحدث رباب هذا يحدث تماما في الأراضي الفلسطينية المحتلة، وهذه الظاهرة تحتاج إلى مواجهتها بالمزيد من التضامن الأممي. بيفرلي تحدثت عن كيف تجذر القادة السود، وتحدثت تحديدا عن مالكوم إكس كيف جاء إلى بيروت وإلى غزة. هذه معلومة كثير مهمة. وتحدث عن كيف قام آخرون بالتحدث عن النساء عن الكفاح النسوي في بورتوريكو من أجل العدالة الإنجابية، وأن هناك تاريخا طويلا من التضامن الكوني بين القادة الأمريكيين من أصول أفريقية وبين المجتمع بشكل عام. إن الشعوب ذات الأصول الأفريقية يعني يعلمون اليوم أكثر من أي وقت مضى عن أهمية تكوين المواطنين العالميين، يعني المواطنين ذوي الاهتمامات والانخراطات العالمية وليس الانخراطات المحلية.
بالتحديد دايما كانوا عايشين،
هم يعرفون دائما
من الأساس.
تمام.
Okay, so thank you so much. I'm just going to, we went a little bit over time, but it has to do with the function of actually trying to make sure that our message and the words that our esteemed speakers gave are explained within Arabic, and sometimes the translation is not exactly the same. As you know, this is a very organic, this is a very effort, love, spontaneous, and it's really labor of love. I want to begin again by thanking the technical team behind the lines that you do not see on the screen that have been doing an amazing job. Anais Amer, Jacob Perez, Rafael Isa, Salim Shhade, and Ubada Kassar. Thank you so much for doing this. Thank you so much, Sarah Sills, for designing a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful graphic. Thank you, Samah and Rania, for doing an amazing job translating. This is really a great job. Thank you. I'm gonna thank myself on behalf of everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabab.
Thank you, our speakers. It's amazing. It's amazing that you took the time. It's amazing that you came here. We hold you in our hearts. We love you from the Arab world, from Palestine to the streets of the United States to all over the world. We are not alone. None of us are alone. We all come together. We learn, we teach, we study, we argue, we debate, we disagree, we go out and continue struggling. Day in and day out. This is not a new thing. This has been going on for a very long time. Thank you so much for being there for our students, for our youth, for members of our communities, for people who don't have internet access, but will be able to watch this with other people again, everywhere around the world. This solidarity cannot be undervalued. You cannot underestimate what it means for people in Gaza, in a refugee camp in Lebanon, in El Barrio, in the favelas, anywhere around the world, to hear your words and know that you are thinking of them, that we are united, and we are united, and we will be, despite our disagreements, and we will be victorious, not tomorrow, the day after. Thank you.
Rabab, if you will allow me just a small statement, if you will allow me to extend a warm appreciation to all the panelists. It has been an honor to be with you virtually. And if I may, on behalf of the activists here in Lebanon, we would love to welcome you back to Lebanon for those who have not been, and to welcome you to come for the first time in Lebanon, particularly when we in Lebanon right now are undergoing, I would argue, a national birth out of the crisis of political and economic bankruptcy. We would welcome you to come and to see our struggle here in Lebanon. We would be honored.
Thank you so
كمان
much.
أنا كمان بدي أشكر بالعربي رباب، وأشكر كل المتحدثين، وأشكر كل الجمهور اللي حضر، وإن شاء الله العدد بده يصدر بالمداخلات كاملة بترجمة طبعا أدق من اللي قمنا فيها هلا بسرعة ضمن الحدود الممكنة. تعرفوا نحن مجموعات مستقلة، نحن لا بنقبض من الأمريكان ولا بنقبض من الصين، لا بنقبض من الإيرانية، ولا بنقبض من الملايكة، ما بنقبض من حدا.
لا هلا بلبنان ما بنقبض.
نحن نفتخر بأننا مستقلين، وعندما نقول مستقل نقول إنه مستقلين مش معناتها إنه نحن ما لنا علاقة، نحن ملتزمون بأقصى الحدود، واستقلالنا نابع من هذا الالتزام. يعني نابع من أن لا نكون
خليني أترجمها هاي الشغلة يا سماح. Samah is saying that you need to know, of course, I mean, I would have stepped in, but you were doing such a great job, so I didn't really have to. But Samah is saying you really need to know that we are all independent groups. We don't get money from the US, we don't get money from China, we don't get money from any of the groups around or the governments and so on. This is a totally independent effort. And this is why it's organic, and this is why we are doubly appreciative of it. We will be posting out. We know that many people have joined us on the screen, and we know that has been streamed. So we will be sharing all of this with you, and we will send you, especially to the participants, the recording as well as the transcripts, so we can actually turn this also to ink on paper, so we can have another way of recording this. Thank you so much for being with us. Okay. Yes. And have a great, great week. And on to the struggle.